understand and also able to help others to be strong and healthy. We pray for the speaker as we come together, give him the right word to speak and teach us about this very important topic. Thank you, Lord, for this time. In the name of Jesus, I pray. Amen. Now we have a video to introduce the counseling center. 我们现在有一个短片介绍一下福边教会的辅导中心。
All right, hello everyone. Welcome to our annual mental health conference. Okay, my name is Lynn Tan. I'm a licensed professional counselor on staff here at FBCC, and I'm so thankful for all of you coming. Before we have our main talk for tonight, I would like to invite a special guest to come up and give a very special mental health testimony of how God has worked in her life and involved the community. And that guest is my very own sister, Joyce. So I'm going to invite Joyce up at this time to share her testimony with us.
My journey with mental health has been full of ups and downs. It's the same as my journey with Christ. Let me give you some background. I grew up in the suburbs of Western Pennsylvania. My mom, sister Lynn, and I went to a Chinese church in Pittsburgh on Sundays, but I didn't feel like I belonged because we didn't go to the same school as the other kids. I was skeptical of what was being taught. I made a decision to abandon church as I got older and entered high school. I was a pretty good student. However, in my sophomore year of high school, I started to act differently. I had trouble sleeping and started having a lot of strange thoughts and talking more than usual. I was experiencing the euphoria of mania, but I didn't know it. I ended up being escorted out of school one day after my mom expressed her concern and ended up staying at a psychiatric hospital for a few weeks while being treated for bipolar disorder. I returned to school on medication, but was a bit disoriented and confused. My grades suffered a bit, even though teachers were very sympathetic. I went from being number 3 in my class to number 35 at the end of graduation, right at the bottom of the top 10%. After high school, I went on to study writing at the University of Pittsburgh. An episode of mania happened again in my first semester. It was difficult to stay focused on my studies, and throughout my college years, I continued to start classes and drop out several times to take breaks with a few trips to the hospital. It was a dark time. I had my first relationship, and it was fun for a while, but it didn't end well. College graduation never came for me. My mother sold our house in Pittsburgh, and we reunited with my sister and dad in Houston, Texas in 2011. My sister went to Houston Chinese Church and invited me to a lot of events. I started attending a small group that was part of HCC on Fridays called Stir Fry, led by James Shaw. Over the course of a few years, I came to know Christ better by studying the Bible and wanted a relationship with him. The fellowship of real friends in small group was encouraging and needed. My husband David and I met in 2013 on an online dating site. From the beginning, we had spiritual conversations, and he was open to going to church. We got baptized together at HCC right after getting married. I finished an associate's in fashion design from Houston Community College around that time. Fast forward to today, I am a member of HCC and attend Pearland Chinese Church with my sister and husband. I am a student of Central State University online studying business administration, and I'm about halfway done. I have 2 side jobs in fashion, working as a sewing teacher's assistant and also in a design studio as a production assistant. I am the owner of 3 small businesses that I am passionate about. At church, I started out helping in the kitchen or by baking for the PCC youth. Helping at Friday youth nights is a part of my weekly routine. God's work is apparent in my life. He is revealing many interesting details and connections in people, places, and things. God has made it possible for me to help people that have questions because either they experienced it themselves or they have children with related conditions. FBCC's Breakthrough Support Group for Young Adults with Mental Health Conditions has welcomed me as a guest, and I've gotten to know the members. I have not had a manic episode or been in the hospital since 2017. I don't have side effects or complaints about my medications, and I take them daily. I thank God for my medications allowing me to function. I feel that I am doing well, even not considering that I have a mental health condition. Knowing Christ has been an integral part of my healing process.
Hey, thanks, Joyce, for having the courage to share. I hope that was an encouragement to you all. All right, at this time, I would like to introduce our speaker for tonight. We're very honored to welcome Dr. Matthew Stanford. He is CEO of the Hope and Healing Center and Institute in Houston, Texas, and adjunct professor of psychiatry at Baylor College of Medicine and Houston Methodist Hospital Institute for Academic Medicine. Dr. Stanford's research on the interplay between psychology and issues of faith has been featured in the New York Times, USA Today, Christianity Today, and U.S. News and World Report. Dr. Stanford earned his doctoral degree in behavioral neuroscience at Baylor University and completed his postdoc at the UT Medical Branch at Galveston. Professionally, he has worked with clients with a variety of mental health conditions, including personality disorders, post-traumatic stress, substance dependence, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia. As director of Hope and Healing Center and Institute, he writes, conducts training seminars, and serves individuals living with mental illness and their families. He's author of 5 books, including his latest, Madness and Grace, a practical guide for pastoral care and serious mental illness, which we'll be giving a little book giveaway at the end of his talk tonight. So let us now prepare our hearts, minds, and spirits as he speaks on the very important topic of mental health in the Asian American church and a Christian response to violence world. Let's welcome Dr. Matt Stanford.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm honored to be here. This is a very special church. I don't think you probably realize how special it is. I've been working with, I'm going to make sure that I time myself because I used to be a college professor, and you will never leave if I do not time myself. So it's a very special place because we've been training churches for a long time. I've been working with churches for a long, long time, and I can tell you that, unfortunately, we are rarely in Asian American churches. And you're going to see some of that reason for that tonight as we look at some of the data related to mental health in Asian Americans and really the difficulty in getting Asian Americans to access care. So we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through. So you have a very special church. I met some of your wonderful counselors about a year ago at a thing, and I'm so happy to be here. So we're going to talk about a number of things tonight. One, we're going to just kind of talk about mental illness in general and what it is and how we might kind of think about it. Then we're going to talk about mental health in Asian Americans here and abroad. And then we're going to talk a little bit about that from a faith perspective, kind of how should we look at that as people in the church and how should we respond. So to begin with, we need to realize that mental health is on a continuum, just like physical health. We're all on a continuum right now as physical health. Some of us feel like we're very, very healthy. We don't have any problems right now. Other ones of us may have a pain or an illness or an infection. But we all are on a continuum from perfect health to illness. But it's the same thing for mental health. And you can see on this continuum here, on one end is perfect mental health, and no one will ever have that. And on the far other end would be someone who met criteria for a mental illness or a mental disorder. And then there's a lot of variation between those two. We are all on this continuum here. Everyone in this room, myself included, are on this continuum. So most of us will live our lives between health and that first white line right there. Okay, we'll move back and forth depending on our circumstances, depending on how well we cope with stress, depending on how much support we have and things like that. So we're going to kind of move around. We may have a good day, things went really well at work, we're getting along with our family, and maybe we're a little bit further towards the health. And then maybe we lose a job, or we have some financial problems, or we get a divorce, or someone in our family dies, and we begin to move towards that first white line, towards the side with mental health problems. But most of us, because of our social support system, because of our resiliency, because of our ability to cope, we're going to be able to maintain in that well-being side there, okay? Now, some of us are going to cross that first white line, and we're going to move into this first section here where it says emotional problems and concerns. We're going to have, instead of a kind of a low level or mild distress, we're going to have kind of a moderate level of distress. We may have a death in the family and we don't know how to cope. We may have lost a job and we can't find a new one and we're having trouble coping with that. Whatever the issue may be, we may just be having a mood issue. And in that situation, our coping skills, our resiliency, our social support just isn't enough. Maybe we don't have it, or maybe it's just not enough for the situation. And there we probably need to go and talk to somebody. Sometime I refer to that first section between the two white lines as kind of counseling issues. You need to go talk to a pastor. You need to go talk to a professional counselor. And they're going to be able to walk along with you and kind of give you the tools and equip you to be able to move back into well-being or towards the well-being side. And that's the thing about the mental health continuum. We all move around on it, okay? And then some people, a smaller subset, are going to cross that other white line. And then they're going to be diagnosed with a mental illness. And they're going to have severe psychological distress. And they are going to not be able to function normally without some kind of intervention. And those individuals might require some medication. They might require a therapeutic intervention. But they're going to be impaired by their illness in a significant way. Okay? Now, those individuals can be treated. Those illnesses can be managed, and those individuals can also move back along that. And it isn't always that we have some underlying biologically driven thing. Look at something like post-traumatic stress disorder. If you're exposed to the right type of traumatic experience, then you might be able to manifest a mental health problem that would put you over in that section. So ultimately, we're all kind of moving around on here, and if we're supporting one another and we're healthy and we have good coping skills, hopefully we can stay on the well-being side. If we need help, we have mental health professionals for that to help us move back. Ultimately, what you should take away from this is mental health is not two buckets where it's like the normal people are in this bucket and the ones who aren't normal are in this bucket. And so I just got to make sure I stay in this bucket. And that's how a lot of people think about it, and that's just not how it is. And like once you get into this bucket, that's it. It's a continuum, and everyone in here is on that continuum, and I'm on that continuum, and I move around on that continuum. And so it's an us issue. It's not a us and them. It's a totally an us. And that's the way we need to look at it. So when you come across somebody with a mental health problem, they're just at a level of distress that you're not at. And so you have an opportunity to be compassionate and to kind of help them move back towards well-being. And that's, in a sense, what a professional counselor or a mental health professional does. They just do it for a living. So now a lot of people ask me, well, what causes a mental illness? What is it that causes a person to have a mental illness? And a lot of times that question is based on something like, is it nature or is it nurture? Is it biology or is it the environment? You'll hear those kind of things. Well, the reality is it is actually both. So it is a biological vulnerability. We all have it, and I'm going to talk about that. And environmental stressors. We also all, I drove over here. I only almost died 2 or 3 times as I came up Beltway 8. And I'm not kidding. Clearly there are some people that have a card that allows them not to follow any traffic laws. And so, it stressed me out coming over here. So stressors happen. You get into arguments. You lose a job, things like that. And ultimately, those two, in a very complex combination, are going to lead to these mental health problems. Now, not every mental health problem is an equal amount of biology and environment. Some are heavily biologically driven. Some are heavily environmentally driven. Some can go either way. So I want to kind of give you a model of how we might kind of think about that and how they kind of go together. But do understand this, every mental health problem is a combination of both, because you and I are biological, just like we are spiritual. We'll talk about that later. You all brought your body tonight, I see. And so you may not like your body, but you have it, okay? And it's very physical, and it can be damaged. And so, it's not just some kind of ethereal thing floating around up here and that you can't touch. Mental health problems have a very biological aspect to them, but they also have a very environmental one as well. So let's think about you as a cup. Think about you as a cup. And this is a stress vulnerability model that I'm going to talk about. So you're a cup, and if that cup overflows, then you have a mental health problem. Okay, just think about it that way. And so we're going to fill that cup with 2 things. We're going to fill it with the amount of biological vulnerability you have, and we're going to fill it with the amount of stress that you deal with in your life, okay? Now, there's 2 things that we need to think about as we think about that. And one is you have ways that you deal with stress. Some people deal with stress better than others, so you have coping skills. You have friends that can support you, professionals that can support you, things like that. So as stress is poured into the cup, you may be able to deal with some stress, and some people can't deal with stress at all, so the cup just fills up faster and faster, okay? In the context of the biological vulnerability, think about it this way. If I were to have, and I'm not asking you to do this, so if I were to ask the ladies in here to raise their hand if you had a mother, grandmother, sister, or aunt who had breast cancer, those that raise their hand, I could say, well, you have a higher vulnerability or a greater risk for breast cancer than women who do not have a first-degree relative that has had breast cancer. And nobody would be upset by that, and nobody would argue with that. Well, the same thing is true for mental health problems. One of the first mental health problems, kind of quote-unquote, that was found to run in families was suicide. They noticed that suicide seemed to be occurring generation after generation in families. What really was running in the family was depression, and there was a biological vulnerability for that. It doesn't mean you're necessarily born with it. It means that you're born with a biological vulnerability. You have a higher risk or potential for having that illness. So for instance, if you have a parent who has a mental illness, then you have a 5 times higher likelihood of having a mental illness yourself than someone who doesn't have a parent. Doesn't mean you're going to have it, just means you have a higher likelihood, okay? So in this equation that we're going to talk about to fill up this cup, the amount of biological vulnerability you have fills the cup up to a certain level, and then you only have that much left to deal with the stress, okay? So let's look at a couple of different kind of examples. So this would just be a normal situation. Everybody has some vulnerability, and you can see in this instance, this person has kind of a low amount of vulnerability, so they have a lot of cups still to fill up, and they must have good coping skills, and they're resilient, and they've got friends to talk to, and when they're struggling with something that they can't deal with, they go see a professional, and they're able to manage the amount of stress, and you can see that their cup is not overflowing, okay? So they, despite the fact that they have some vulnerability, which we all do, like for instance, in my family, the vulnerability is to alcoholism. My father once set my brother and I down as probably way too young, early adolescence, and scared us by telling us that every Stanford male in our family had died from alcoholism. And basically they had. And so he said, don't ever drink alcohol. That was his answer to that. And he did not drink alcohol because of that. And anxiety. A family has a lot of anxiety. So I know that I have the tendency for that. So that's the vulnerability. So now let's look at one where it does overflow. In this instance, you can see there's an enormous biological vulnerability, which leaves very little room for stressor. And this may be something like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. Those are both very heavily biologically driven. They're really looked at more as almost neurodegenerative disorders now. An individual with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder that is untreated can lose up to 5% of their brain matter a year. Because literally they're losing brain cells because it's neurodegenerative. There's also other issues that go beyond the brain with those illnesses, but very heavily biologically driven. Very little environmental stressor plays, but it doesn't take much stressor to then cause the illness to manifest. So, what can we do about that? Well, we can go in and we can provide some pharmacological intervention. We just had this wonderful testimony. She talked about taking medication that had helped her. She's seen therapists. She's going to church to help deal with these different things. So in essence, what you're doing is you're kind of poking holes in the cup. And so as you poke holes in the cup and you let stuff out, then the cup doesn't overflow. So it doesn't matter if it's a biological vulnerability that's driving it or the stressor. In this instance, it's a very small vulnerability, but it's a lot of stressor. So that would maybe be something like a trauma. So maybe the individual was, exposed to a pandemic or something like that. And so there's an interesting thing in trauma research. There's a questionnaire that we hand out, and you have people fill out whether they've ever experienced a trauma. And you used to actually be able to fill that out, and you'd have people that had never experienced a trauma, but you can't hand it out anymore, because all of us have experienced a trauma. You all felt the anxiety of that, and some people have post-traumatic stress issues as a result. So they have a very small biological vulnerability towards that issue, but then they have so much stress they're unable to cope or deal with it, and it overflows. So ultimately, when we think about these issues, you have to remember, number one, it's not an us and them thing, it's us. And number two, when the person is sitting in front of you and you think this is a mental health problem, this is not something that they didn't try hard enough, they didn't pray enough. This is something that is driven by factors that they have very little control over. They can learn how to control their stress. They can learn how to help manage the biological vulnerabilities, but those are not things that you just kind of innately know. And so you're looking at a person in distress, and so our response should be more one of compassion than one of, I wonder why they're the way they are, which unfortunately happens a lot of times. So we're going to talk now about mental health in the Asian American population, and then kind of generally in the population as a whole. All right, so this number is a little bit old, so it's actually, unfortunately, that we've seen a significant increase in mental health problems. And I know we like to blame the pandemic for everything because it was horrible, But if you look at the mental health data for, in the decade coming up to the pandemic, it was already on a steep rise. We were already in big trouble. And then the pandemic was like a giant magnifying glass that just made it go really insane. So about 6.1% of the population is Asian American, and so that's about 15% of that population meets criteria for a mental illness. Roughly 2.9 million individuals, because you have roughly 20 million individuals that would fall into the category of being Asian American. Now, one of the problems you're going to see in this data is just a product of just kind of bad research in general, and that is when you use the term Asian American, that is so badly defined. It includes almost anybody from one giant area of the world. And so you'll see that as we go through. And those different groups vary pretty significantly culturally, and they even differ in the way they express mental health issues. And you'll see that in a little bit of the data that I'll show here. So as a whole, this is a recent study with college students, which are always a really good measure because that's in the kind of onset range of mental health problems. Half of all chronic mental health conditions are in place by 14 years old. So 50% are in place by 14 years old, 75% by 24 years old. So the majority of mental health problems are going to begin between 14 and 24 years old. So this is not an issue that we should think of as an adult issue. This is an issue really of the youth, older or kind of adolescents and young adults. And so that's when we really want to be able to intervene, or even earlier if possible, because it's much easier to treat if you intervene early. But what you find here is that you can see the Asian Pacific Islander students, they really don't differ dramatically, except maybe in eating disorders, from other students. And so you don't see a higher rate. And that's a good thing. I mean, you're not seeing a higher rate in Asian Americans, but what you are seeing is about the same rates. And unfortunately, that's what I said, that's actually a little bit higher. It's about 1 out of every 4 individuals now. It's gone up. Before the pandemic, it was probably about 1 out of every 5. Now it's about 1 out of every 4 individuals is struggling with a mental health problem in a given year. And that's a lot of people. I mean, that's a lot more people than you would think of. There's probably, I don't know, maybe 58 to 60 million individuals in a given year with a mental health problem. If you think about, and that's just adults, that doesn't include children. If you think about diabetes, which I imagine everyone in here either has diabetes or knows somebody with diabetes, there's only 24 million children and adults with diabetes in the United States. But there's about 58 to 60 million adults alone with mental health problems. And you see 1 out of every 5 children and adolescents have a mental health problem too. So the numbers are just absolutely unbelievable. It's really our worst problem that we just simply never talk about it. So very similar to other students, but this is the problem, I think, when you look at a lot of this data, and that is there's some pretty significant differences between kind of distress levels in kind of subgroups within what is normally just kind of combined together. So this is some data from the federal government that came out about 2 years ago, looking at data from 2010 to 2014. This is pre-pandemic data. And you can see these are measure of severe psychological distress. And when people display a level of severe psychological distress, they're going to meet criteria for a mental illness. It doesn't matter what it is. They're just at that kind of level of distress. And that's kind of the general, just about every year, somewhere between 3 to 4% of Americans will meet criteria for severe psychological distress. And then here it's kind of broken down by kind of Asian subgroups. But you can see there's quite a difference between Vietnamese and the others. Okay, the others are all about the same. And then you look at another study that was done during the pandemic that looked at psychological distress in subgroups within different ethnicities during the pandemic. And I mean, you can see, everybody's much higher than they are outside of the pandemic. But look at Southeast Asians and South Asians. They're way higher than, that's a hugely significant difference. a lot of this probably has to do with cultural differences, has to do with resources, has to do, with a lot of things, support. I mean, they may be in the South Asians may have smaller groups to support them. I mean, whatever. But there's some significant differences. And I think one of the problems that I find in the literature as I'm going through is that everybody's just kind of clumped together and just thrown into this pile, over here. And so you don't really see that kind of heterogeneity as you do in some other ethnicities. They're more homogeneous. So I think that, there's some issues here with some of the data. Now, this is the problem, okay? And the problem is that, and this is the reason that I have only stood and done this in one other Asian church in all the years that I've been doing this. Asian Americans do not seek mental health care. They're at the lowest. Of ethnic groups, they are the most difficult to get to seek care. The fact that you have a counseling center is such an anomaly that I really can't even tell you how I was so happy to meet them when I met them at this thing, because it just doesn't happen. We have been training churches since 2017. We have trained over 500 congregations in the Houston area, and one of them was Asian American. One. So it's just a really, and here we are, number 2. So I'm excited about that, because obviously we have to start somewhere. But you can see here, if you look at this, Asian American Pacific Islander on the top, only 18% access care of those that are diagnosed with a mental health problem. Hispanic and African American are about the same. It's always stayed somewhere in the 20s. You can see this is American Indian, Alaskan Natives, and then Caucasian. But even with Caucasian, that number never gets over 50%. And no matter how much money the federal government spends on mental illness, in fact, between 2000 and 2020, we had a 201% increase in our spending on mental health problems in the U.S. That's $163 billion was put into the system to try to, and we never got over 50% for anybody, a number of people that get care. And for those who do get care, or are lucky enough to get care, which is a minority of people, the average period of time that goes by from the onset of symptoms, which most commonly happens between 14 and 24 years, the period of time that goes by from the onset of symptoms to first treatment is 11 years. That's the average. So just think about that for a minute. What medical problem have you ever had that you woke up and you go, I've got this problem, I think I'll wait 11 years before I get somebody to take a look at it? I mean, that's a huge stain on our country, that we really just don't treat people with mental health problems. We just have a tendency to just allow them to suffer. In fact, sadly, what we do is there are 10 times more people with mental illness in jails and prisons than there are in hospitals. In the United States today, there are less than 100,000 psychiatric beds in the entire country. I mean, just think about that for a minute. I mean, that sounds like I made that up, okay? I mean, less than 100,000 psychiatric beds in the entire country. And I can tell you right now that 58 million people a year have a mental health problem. So it's really very disturbing. Now, you might ask, why do Asian Americans, kind of broadly defined, why did they not go get care? And I think, and there's probably a lot of answers to that question, but I think this is a study I came across that I like to use. This study was done, it was interviews with Asian American women that struggle with depression or had depression in their family, and did they get care or not care, why did they go, things like that. And I think this study really had some very kind of telling statements. And these are kind of the 4 biggest things that they found in relationship to this study, and why these women chose not to go and get treatment. conflicting cultural values are impacting them, their sense of control, that they don't feel like they have control over their own decisions. That decision is more likely to be made for them in a cultural sense. Does that make sense? So the culture decides for them, and the culture has decided that's not a good thing. They don't have that personal autonomy to make the decision. That was the first thing they found. They're kind of unrealistic standards that have been set for them. And so if I were to admit that I have depression, well, then I'm going to not be able to meet those standards, so they will kind of put on a brave face type of thing. They've, again, learned to be silent. This was an interesting one. In fact, the only other church that I spoke at was Korean. It was mostly Korean. And, the pastors there were telling me how they actually knew of families who had family members that were ill, and they actually were discouraging their family member to get care because they were afraid that it would bring a shame on their family. And that's, that isn't just something that occurs in Asian Americans. I'll give you an example. I worked in New Orleans for a long, long time. I was a professor at the University of New Orleans. And I had a young man, African-American young man, who had a mentally ill aunt. It was a mentally ill cousin. And so and we were treating his cousin. But he had been basically kind of hidden away in a back room in their home forever, not getting care. And I asked him, why is it that you don't like to talk about your mentally ill cousin, but you don't have a problem talking about he had a cousin who was kind of a criminal, who had just gotten out of prison, this guy was just kind of somebody they talked about and hung out with. But this other person, there was a lot of shame. And he said, Doc, Doc, my cousin, he has problems with criminal justice and all that kind of stuff. Those are his problems. Those are his decisions. And people know that that's his problem. That's not our family's problem. But if you talk about my other cousin and people find out that he said crazy, they'll think there's something wrong with all of us in our family. That'll be a family thing. And I thought that no one had ever described it to me in such a clear way, because he really was talking about that kind of biological vulnerability. He was saying, well, there's something wrong with us as a family but having described to you how it is on a continuum and moves around, it really doesn't have anything to do with the family. We all have biological vulnerabilities. There's no one who's ever not had a biological vulnerability. And then finally, they fear the stigma for their family that was very similar to the one before it. So I think it was a very telling study. It was a really well-done study with some very in-depth interviews. And, I think ultimately it's the same type of thing that's happening on a broader scale, but it's just intensified in this community. And just because there's a lot of kind of cultural drives to keep people from or not wanting to go get care. And again, I think that's why I'm so excited to be here, and I'm so excited that you have a successful counseling center, because it's only when it's demonstrated to people that these things are effective and that they certainly work within the context of a faith community, that they are very much along the lines of our faith and our beliefs. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. And then I think people are much more open to them. All right, so then, this is kind of more of a more post-pandemic issue, but in more recent studies that have been done, particularly with young adult Asian Americans, we do know that there's increasing kind of hate crimes that are occurring. It's not just increasing with Asian Americans. It's probably increased more so, I'm going to show you some data in a minute, more so towards Asian Americans, but there isn't a category in which it hasn't increased kind of post-pandemic. We're in a real mess right now. After the pandemic. Now, a lot of this is driven by the pandemic and this, the idea of kind of the virus came out of China and that kind of thing, obviously. So we do see that in all the studies that are done now, there's an extremely high rate of kind of fear, of kind of retaliation or kind of hate crimes towards the Asian American community. And so people really are living in fear. And if you're living in fear, that is an environmental stressor. And if you don't have the coping skills and the support to deal with that, well, then that's going to begin to fill up that cup. And if you already have a high vulnerability, that's going to fill that cup up faster. So you see what I'm saying? So those types of things in and of themselves can cause these things to begin to manifest because it's kind of a cumulative type of thing. So this is a pretty significant issue, but as I said, I mean, you can almost look at any ethnic group. In fact, I even have a slide that breaks it down even further, and believe it or not, I know this is really kind of an odd thing, so you don't hear about it a lot, but the federal government does track hate crimes based on an enormous number of kind of ways that we divide ourselves up. There's been a significant increase in hate crimes against whites. I mean, it's just, there's almost no group you can think of that there has not been an increase, particularly post-pandemic. We don't discuss stuff anymore. We shoot each other. And so it's gotten to an unbelievable, and then if we can find any obvious difference between each other, we just exacerbate that. And we'll want to talk about that, and we can talk about that more from a theological perspective. But all hate crimes are up, you can see 38%. But you do see that for Asian hate crimes, there is a much significant. Now, I will say this, it's a huge increase because, frankly, it actually was quite low to begin with, which was actually a good thing, but it has really jumped up there. And so this contributes, again, to the manifestation of mental health problems. And so definitely something that has to be done about. So how are we going to respond to this? What is the church's response to mental health issues? We know that finances and stigma are the two things that keep people from getting care the most, regardless of your ethnicity, okay? It's very expensive, mental health care. A lot of insurances don't cover it. Less than half of psychiatrists in the United States still take insurance. It's all cash pay. So very expensive. And then stigma, that's the second most significant thing. So what are we going to do? What is our response as a church and then as a people that follow the Lord? So the first thing we have to understand is I told you that a majority of people don't get care, but the statistic that brought me out of academics to begin working at the Hope and Healing Center and us to start all these programs where we train churches is the fact that it's been known for 7 decades that people in psychological distress, people struggling with mental health problems, are more likely to engage a clergy before they go to a physician or a mental health care provider. And what's particularly odd about that statistic is it's anyone in the general population, not just people that go to church, not just people that believe in God. Anyone in the general population is more likely to go to a clergy when they're struggling with these problems before they go to a physician or a mental health care provider. Now, the problem is very few clergy ever make a referral because they don't recognize what's in front of them. So somebody comes in and they say, I'm not getting along with my wife, and I want to talk to you, pastor. Well, the pastor says, well, here's some communication issues, let's pray. And he doesn't realize, well, the guy has depression, or he just doesn't understand that behind it could be something else. And I'll give you kind of an odd example, but this actually happened. This was a couple that I actually worked with. So it was a couple, they had a few younger children, and the husband, when he would come home in the evening, his wife had started spending money at a rate that was just way beyond their means. So he came, and I mean like this, I want you to just imagine this for a minute, you married guys. You come home and there's a new car in the driveway, and you had no idea that she was going to buy a new car. And you come home another day and there's a boat. Okay, and so this is what's happening. He came home one day and she bought 2 brand new sets of ping golf clubs, about $1,000 each. She didn't even play golf. Okay, so in the span of a very short period of time, I'm talking within a span of like a week and a half to 2, she had spent every penny they had in their bank account and was charging their credit cards to the max. Now, every night they're fighting over this. He's begging her to stop. And she's like, hey, everybody has credit, uses credit in America. That's just how it is. Everybody's got some debt. It's not that big a deal. It's no big deal. And then she would just continue to spend and spend and spend. Now, after about 2 weeks, she's, in essence, bankrupt them, okay? She also is kind of showing some other odd, behaviors, but he couldn't take anymore. So there were people of faith. He made an appointment with the pastor. He took her in with him to see the pastor. He said, "Pastor, I don't know what's going on. She spent all of our money. I'm ready to take the children and leave. We literally, we're going to lose our house. We're going to lose everything because she has done this. I don't know what to do." She says the same thing to the pastor. "It's okay. Everybody has a little debt. It's not that big a deal." And so the pastor, in his wisdom, he said, "This is obvious what the problem is. You're just not being a good steward of the money that God has given you." And so he put them in a financial peace university class. Have you ever heard of that? Do you know what that is? It's like Dave Ramsey. You ever heard of that guy? He teaches people to get out of debt. And a lot of churches have his kind of class, and it teaches how to get out of debt. So he put her in that. I mean, we're talking he fixed this in his mind in about 10 minutes, okay? And about a week and a half later, and they started going to the class, and a week and a half later, she had a psychotic break and she was hospitalized, okay? So she had bipolar disorder. I mean, that was a manifestation of her first manic episode. He never bothered to ask that, well, what was she like before 2 weeks ago when she started spending all the money? She actually was kind of frugal. She didn't spend money. They had always gotten along well. They were very careful with their money, things like that. He never asked any questions. He just looked at it and he saw that it was a spiritual issue. She was a poor steward of the monies. And so there was, in my opinion, there was no reason for her to have a psychotic break. There was no reason for her to be hospitalized. If somebody comes in to talk to us and they say, they're just spending excessively, well, we know in an instant. But he wasn't aware that, so he was doing the best he can. So we're missing an opportunity here. And we're not just missing an opportunity from a mental health perspective. We're missing a divine opportunity, in my opinion. I mean, name something else that people in the world that don't know Christ are more likely to go to a church first before they go to services in the world to try to get help. So what we tell pastors when we go in and do training is, we're not here to teach you how to start a mental health ministry. We're just here to help you have resources to help the people that are already coming. So people in the congregation or the people that might come to a event that you have from the community, they're already coming. They just don't walk in the door and say, "I woke up this morning and I think I have bipolar disorder." They go, "I lost another job. I can't hear from God anymore." Whatever it might be. Sometimes it may sound spiritual, sometimes not. But we know that they're more likely to come here before they are to come to my clinic. So I think we don't want to not be prepared for that. I think that's something that God has divinely done for us to try to give us an opportunity to serve the broken. All right, so what is being done in churches? That should be your next question. That was the next question I asked when I first came across this statistic when I was still living in New Orleans, and I thought, well, if a majority of people don't get help with mental health problems, and we know that this big subset of them are going to churches first, this is easy to fix, right? Well, the problem is, and this is all broken down by a bunch of in different ways. There was a huge study that was done a couple years ago. To summarize this whole slide, about 23 to 25% of churches in the United States offer some type of ministry for people with mental health problems. That's pretty bad. That's pretty bad. That, just about a quarter. Now, you see that one at the top, the 68%. In this study, these are pastors that were surveyed here. 68% of the pastors that were surveyed said that their church had a referral list, a list of, if you're struggling here, you can call this guy, this pastor or this counselor or this psychiatrist. So a referral list. And that's a good idea, although you have to constantly be checking it and keeping it up to date and things like that. But when they went to the congregants, another part of this study, the congregants of those pastors and asked them about the referral list, only 28% knew that the referral list existed. So if it existed and nobody knows about it, I mean, I guess you guys, you'll know you got a room over here. It's full of money, free money. You just go in and you just pick up how much ever money you want. Y'all know about that, right? They told you about that. So, if you have something and you don't tell people that you have it, it'll never get used. And so, what the take-home issue here is churches are doing almost nothing. And most pastors, when I tell them that people are more likely to come to them before they come to me, they're shocked. They don't know that. And when I was still at Baylor, as a professor at Baylor, I had a student actually do a study where she assessed the mental health training at all the accredited seminaries in North America. And basically, 0 of them provide training for the MDiv programs, the standard, degree that a pastor will get. There's almost no training for them whatsoever. And so they just simply don't know what they're looking at. And so that's what this program that we have developed hopefully will help as we train in different churches. So now let's talk about this from a faith perspective. And we'll also talk a little bit about some of the horrible things going on in the world now that kind of contribute to this. I mean, I think sometimes we forget that we live in a fallen world. I think we know that bad things happen, but I think we also have kind of been, and I'll be the first one to tell you. I mean, I do it as well. We fall into kind of this, like, well, if we just get this leader in place, or if we just get this law passed, or if we can just get back to the way it was in 19 whatever, then everything's going to be great. Well, the take-home message is this: the world is fully fallen. It has always been fully fallen, and it will always be fully fallen until Christ returns, period. So if we are investing our time in kind of worldly systems, those worldly systems they're bent, they're sinful, they're broken. And so I think we have to understand that, we should expect that things are going to be bad. It should not shock us when things are bad. And it does. It shocks us oftentimes. It should not shock us that our political system is contrary to our faith. Why would it not be? It's part of the fallen world. Those types. It should not shock us that racism is rampant. Why would it not be? People that live as part of the world, they're an enemy of God. So why would they be in support of us? So I say that because I think sometimes expectation is what alters kind of our ability to deal with things. And so we look at an issue like mental health and we say, well, that's not really a church issue. That's the world will take care of that. There's some things out there that, but God's sending them here first. And I think we have to be prepared for that. So I think that one of the first things we do is we recognize it's a fully fallen world. So whether we're looking at a high level, we're looking at why do mental health issues happen? Because it's a fallen world. And so, I mean, we could talk about why do biological vulnerabilities happen? Because it's a fallen world. I mean, and those types of things. And so we want to understand what happened to Adam and Eve and what happens to us in the context of us being fallen before we come to know the Lord. And then what happens to us as we know the Lord? Because a lot of times what I'll see is people will say, well, if a person just knows the Lord, they can't be depressed. How could they ever be depressed? They know the Lord. In fact, I was sitting in a restaurant once when I was in college, and some guy over here was talking super loud, probably because he's from Texas, and he said something like along the lines of, well, the Apostle Paul would never be able to be depressed because whatever. He was just going on and on. Basically saying, well, Christians can't be depressed. Christians can't have anxiety. Anxiety's a sin. You ever heard someone say that? So, if it's schizophrenia, that's just demonic possession. But you don't say that about liver cancer or diabetes or things like that. And those are all because of a fallen world. So let's think about for a minute how God has created us. And so when I think about a person, I think about a person as having multiple parts to their being. So you all brought your body. I brought my body. I'm ready to trade my body in any time. Somebody wants to trade it in for a younger version, but I got it, okay? And so, but I'm also more than this. I'm more than physical. And so when I look at the scripture, look at something like Mark 12, where Jesus is asked what the greatest commandment is. He says, love the Lord with your whole self, and he names off physical parts like strength, and he names off non-physical parts. And then he says, love your neighbor as yourself. Those are your relationships. So I see 4 aspects to our being. We have a spirit, we have a mind, we have a physical body, and we have relationships. That's how we interact with the world around us. Even more so if you look at something like Luke 2:52, and Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and favor with God and man. There's the 4 facets right there of the incarnate Christ. And so when I look at a person with a mental health problem, I know they're affected at all of those levels. And I'm going to need to engage them at all those levels, okay? But let's step back for a minute and think about the fall. So Adam and Eve fell, okay? Well, when you eat of the fruit of the tree, you're going to die, okay? And they did. They started to die at that time. They started to age, and they were going to deteriorate over time. So that was part of it. But we know that spiritually they died. So they were torn free from that union that they had with the Creator. And so they were no longer in a spiritual union with Him. They now had in what we would describe as a dead spirit. They were spiritually separated from Him. And so they had a spirit, but it was a separated spirit, a spirit separated from God. And that affected their mind, and that affected their body, and that affected their relationships. I mean, think about how fast it affected their relationships. It's not my fault, it's her fault. She made me eat it. I mean, that's right off the bat. And so there was shame, so they're affected, okay? Now, think about us. How do we come to this world? We come to this world just like them. We are torn free. We are dead. We have no hope, zero. And I think that's another thing that we a lot of times forget as believers. We forget how bad of a state we were in. We had no hope. And we are in a fallen and dead world. And so we are living our lives separate from God, no matter how long you do that. And you are born with physical vulnerabilities and weaknesses. You are born with, develop thought patterns that affect you, and your relationships are damaged. And then you come to know the Lord. You came to saving faith in Christ, and now you are transformed in the inner man instantaneously. You now have the Holy Spirit in you, and the very life of Christ is placed inside of you. You sit at the right hand of God in Christ in the heavenlies. You stand blameless before Him in the spiritual realm. You're done spiritually. But what about all that other stuff? You still have the mind, you still have the body, you still have the relationships. And those don't just instantaneously get better. So when you go into the pastor and the pastor says, "Oh, I know you have depression. All we got to do is go through the Psalms and you're just going to get right with God and everything's going to be..." Well, if you're a believer, spiritually you are right with God. So doesn't mean you can't grow in your relationship, but you have Christ's life inside of you. So there are other parts that need to be transformed over time. So Paul says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So as we submit to the indwelling Spirit, as we submit to His leading, we are changed over time. But that's a lifetime process. So for us to say to somebody, and I know you don't do that here, but some churches do, well, you just need to pray more, would be no different than me saying, well, the only thing you need to fix your mental illness is just take this pill. Because that's just focusing on one aspect. We really need to take a holistic approach where we're dealing with the whole person. And that's another unique aspect of faith communities. Only in a faith community do you have the opportunity to deal with the person at all levels of their being. If you're at a secular clinic, they're only going to deal with you at certain other levels. We have a faith-based clinic, uses an integrated approach, so we deal with people at all levels, but that's not common. And so in a faith community, you have opportunity to deal with a person spiritually, deal with a person mentally, physically, and ultimately relationally as well. So this is how we should see people. This is how we should see ourselves. And so we don't focus on one aspect, we focus on them holistically. And don't get, my wife always says, you got to be careful using that word, because when Christians hear holistic, they think Eastern. Well, I'm taking it back, okay? So I'm taking the word back. So it just means whole, and this is how God has made us. And so we're fallen, we come to know Christ, we're transformed in the inner man, but we still struggle on the outside with this kind of broken flesh and broken relationships and broken thoughts. And I think the thing that we have to understand, ultimately, at the end of the day, the greatest thing that we have to give somebody is the gospel. And, I left academics and I went into full-time ministry, and we serve people out of our calling to Christ. And so, if I help somebody with their mental health problems, I am building a relationship, an opportunity that I might share with them the good news. And I'm going to give you an example of that in just a minute. But what the gospel, the kind of everything we do needs to be kind of on the foundation of the gospel. And what the gospel says is that change should be expected. We are not okay before we know the gospel. And when we hear the gospel, we're changed, we're transformed. And as we grow in our faith, we're transformed more and more and more. And so a church should be a place that expects change. When people come in the door, they're not at the level they're going to be at. So there's no greater example in my mind of what I've seen in the world of change than working with people with mental health problems. They come in and they are a disaster. And if they get the right treatment and the right care and the right support, they are changed. And what an incredible place for that to happen, because we can provide them with a hope that transcends circumstances. The hope of the secular world of mental health is that I can deal with your symptoms, but I can't always get your symptoms to be better. In fact, sometimes I can only get them to a certain level. And if that's all the hope you have, then you lose hope. But our hope isn't a feeling, it's a person. It's Jesus, and it transcends circumstances. So the gospel tells us to expect change and to look for change and to know that change is a good thing because we've been changed. And so we should be happy when people come in and they're a disaster, because there's no greater place to change than here. All right, so let me give you a story. So this story is a very near and dear to my heart, because this story is kind of the story that I kind of really went to as I was trying to develop some of the things that we use. And I'll end with this. And so this kind of helps me talk about what do I think a church ought to be able to do? Because that's a big question. That's the first question that the pastor asks, well, what do you expect us to be able to do with people that have mental health problems? So in this story of the man born blind, we get a great example of how Jesus dealt with people who were suffering. Now, he doesn't have a mental health problem. He obviously is under a lot of stress and deals with a lot of problems, but he is an outcast of society at that time. So it says Jesus and his disciples were walking along, and Jesus saw this man, which I always thought was an interesting part of the story, because, the disciples, they're come on. Those are the 12 best guys he could get. They're really a mess most of the time. So they don't even see this suffering guy, and Jesus does. And so Jesus sees him, and clearly Jesus must have moved towards him, because now he's interacting with him. And the disciples, when they see him, the first thing they say is, well, Rabbi, who sinned that this man would be born blind? His parents or him? And the first thing that goes through your head is, no, wait a minute, wasn't he born blind? How did he sin if he was born that way? Well, they actually believed that it was possible to sin in utero. In the Talmud, which is kind of a commentary on the Old Testament, there's a description of if a woman bows to an idol and she's pregnant, the baby bows also. So the baby is also culpable for idolatry. So they had things like that. So they believed that. And so in their theology, if everything was going right for you, everything was, that means you were in good with God. You were righteous. If you were disabled or you had a problem or you were poor, well, then things weren't going right for you. God was punishing you. Does that sound familiar? You ever heard anything like that nowadays? That's still around, okay? And so Jesus destroys that theology in one statement. He says, neither it was that this man was this way so that the power of God or the glory of God, depending on your translation, might be manifest in his life. And so that, again, is an incredible statement, because really what it says is this man's disability is an opportunity for him to be drawn closer to me. And that's how we should see people with mental health problems. This is just an opportunity for them and for you, because God's put them in front of you to draw you both closer to God. So this story, this is where Jesus spits on the ground. He makes the clay, sticks them in the guy's eyes. If you're ever interested, Jesus spits on a lot of people. And so it's kind of interesting. Look, that he puts his fingers in, wet fingers on people and stuff. Saliva, it says in the Talmud, of a firstborn son is supposed to have medicinal properties. So he was just using a remedy of the day, and we'll see why as you kind of go through the story. So he tells the man to go wash and then go show himself to the chief priest. The man does that. The chief priests, of course, they don't, who are you? You're not the man. You're not the one that was healed. They go find his parents. And really the saddest part of the story, they ask the parents, is this your son? So remember, this man's been literally blind since birth. And his parents now walk in and he can see, and they say, well, he's an adult, ask him. I mean, they're so afraid of the religious group there that they don't even want to connect. So they kind of shun their own son. Ultimately, they throw this guy out. They say, you're not the man. They humiliate him. And it says Jesus finds him later. The funny part of the story is they go, well, who healed you? And he kind of says, he doesn't really say it in this words, but he kind of implies, I don't know who healed me, I was blind. And so Jesus did not tell him who he was. So Jesus hears about what happens. He finds the man. He expresses to him who he is. This is the section of Scripture where Jesus shows himself as the light of the world. So the man sees the light, and then he sees the true light. And so he's transformed physically, and he's transformed spiritually. And then he's made part of a new family. He's no longer an outcast. He's now part of the family of God. He has now people around him and things like that. So it's an incredible story of physical transformation and spiritual transformation, but I think it is a model for what we are called to in relationship to people that are suffering, that are placed in front of us. And so when people ask me, what do I believe that a church should be able to do? I think you should be equipped to do 4 things. Number 1, you should be prepared to recognize a mental health care problem. That does not mean diagnose. That means that if you've sat down with somebody and their husband says she is spending tons and tons of money, that you know the right questions to ask to be able to say, this may be a mental health problem. We need to get a mental health care provider involved. That's it. Not the diagnosis, just the recognition, okay? I mean, in a sense, if you think about that story, Jesus recognized that the man needed something, that he was in distress. Number 2, you need to know how to make a referral, okay? Now, you have a wonderful counseling center here, and I'm sure they could actually help with that, or they could provide services themselves, but most churches don't have that. So how do you make a referral? Who do you make a referral to? What does that look like, okay? And so that's another thing. I mean, if you recognize there's a mental health problem and you just say, hey, you got a mental health problem, go find something, I will tell you they won't do it. They just don't. They're not able to do it. It's very hard to access the system. Thirdly, you need to know how to relate to somebody. What if somebody walked into your service on Sunday and started making a lot of noise? Would you know what to do? Or would you do what a lot of churches do? And I don't know what you do, so I might get myself in trouble here. But what a lot of churches have police officers well, I'll just give you an example. I had a client, she had schizoaffective disorder, which is a horrible form of schizophrenia, and she became hyper-religious and obsessed with Catholicism, even though she wasn't raised Catholic. So she would go around Houston on Sunday, and she would go into Catholic churches, and then during the service, she would get up and walk up onto the stage and get behind the pulpit, and she would start to want to, and so as I can tell you, she has been drug out of some of the nicest Catholic churches in this town, okay? And I mean drug out and kind of tossed out the back door. We got to do better than that. That's and I've just seen that happen many, many times. So would you know how to de-escalate a situation? Would you know how to deal with a panic attack? Would you know how to do a suicide assessment? That's what relating is, relating to a person in distress. Would you know what kind of words to use and not use when you're talking to somebody about mental health? And then finally, restoration. Do you have restorative programs within your faith community? Support groups, mental health coaching, things like that. Are you becoming a healing community? Because it's not just about somebody coming in the door and then them getting a referral and then going out. It's about somebody coming in the door and you recognizing that they're in distress and offering them assistance to ease their suffering, like Jesus did with the man born blind, and then revealing the Savior to them and drawing them into this healing community. That's what he did in that story. And I think that's what he's calling us to do in relationship to people with mental health problems. And he's teed it up for us. He's sending them to us. You don't even have to put a sign out to say, come on in. You just have to be here because they're just going to show up. So these are the four things. And then tomorrow, Mariana, one of my colleagues at Hope and Healing, she's going to be doing our Empower training. And the Empower training is based around these four. There's about a half an hour training related to each one, and you learn how to do these things. And then you're equipped to be able to minister to people with mental health problems. Then we have even more training beyond that she'll talk about to help equip your congregation. Ultimately, at the end of the day, God is sending people with mental health problems to us. It doesn't matter whether you understand them or not. It doesn't matter even where you think they come from. They're people in distress. And, I don't understand cancer, but I would show compassion to somebody in distress or someone with cancer. It's just the same thing. We just need to show them compassion. So I will leave it at that, and I think we're going to take a few questions, and then tomorrow we'll have the Empowered training, and we have a whole set. I will tell you, Mariana will tell you tomorrow, but we do have a website. It's mentalhealthgateway.org, or you can go to hhci.org, but mentalhealthgateway.org. All the training is there, all the resources are there, everything's there. You can access it if for some reason you're not able to make that training tomorrow. Are they just going to yell it out? Okay, so I'm happy to take a few questions. I cannot see you at all, and so they have a microphone, but if you're close, you might just say it. I can always repeat it.
We will take 3 questions because it's 9 o'clock. And
don't be shy. I've heard it all, believe me. I've heard it all.
Anyone? We have the microphone.
Thank you. Hi, Dr. Stanford. Thank you so much. So I was wondering, for those who want to continue more formal training or want to go to school that integrate faith and psychology, what are some places either in Texas or out of state that we could turn to?
Okay, that's a good question. Well, first I would say this. The majority of people who advertise themselves as, say, Christian counselors did not go to a faith-based program. The majority of them, because there aren't very many. They just went to a regular kind of secular mental health program to get their licensure, and then they usually will do like an internship at like a Christian counseling center. There are different ones you can go to. We actually have one here in town with HBU, which is now HCU. They have a Christian counseling track. Another one in Texas is at the seminary in Dallas, at Dallas Theological Seminary. They have a master's, and you can get they actually still call it biblical counseling because it's a real old program, but we won't get into that because sometimes That's got a bad moniker these days. But that's a really good one. I actually we had a staff member that had that. Outside of Texas, you can go to Biola, Wheaton. There's a number of really strong Christian colleges that have master's programs in that. If you want to do it at the doctoral level, that becomes really difficult because, even Baylor, where I was a professor for a long time, we had a doctor of clinical psychology, but it's not an integrated program. It's just a secular program. So it's harder to find it at the doctoral level. What I would suggest is if you're not able to go to an integrated program, that you get involved with an association like the American Association of Christian Counselors or the Christian Psychological Association, because those are people that do it on a regular basis. They're integrating their faith, and you can get a lot of extra training and certification through those organizations, even if you got a secular degree. So.
Just want to follow up on that answer. DTS just started up a Chinese counseling ministry program this fall. For those who are interested, taking that in Chinese.
Well, another one that's not too far away is New Orleans Baptist Theological also they have some really good faculty there, so that's not too far away. Most of these programs are online now, which is, like Liberty has like 10,000 programs online. You can get, so a lot of the Christian colleges have gone online, and that's another thing I would look at. And most of the online programs are accredited as well. That was the problem in the past. They weren't accredited, but they are now.
Dr. Stanford, a question over here on your right.
There you are. I see you.
Okay. Most of the brothers and sisters in church, they have no idea about mental illness because they are not in mental health or in medical field. So what do you suggest to help people to understand, instead of saying, oh, you need to pray more, you need to read the Bible? Because those people who really suffer with mental illness, they feel like they've been isolated or they've been blamed on.
No, that's a great question. That's a really good question because, I know a lot about mental health problem. I went to school forever to get this degree and everything. But the thing is that the average person doesn't. I think what we have to do is we, as the church, and this gets back to the whole idea of a fallen world and everything, we have allowed ourselves to become very isolated and insular as churches. We basically, and I'm not just talking about this church, I'm talking about the big church at sea. We have this building we kind of go hide in to stay away from the world and make sure that we got to keep everything in here just right, because out there is really bad, and out there is really bad. But we are no longer citizens of the world. We are citizens of heaven. We are ambassadors, and we are expected to go out. And when somebody out there that doesn't know the Lord, or even if they do, come in here and they're in distress, we need to see them in that holistic way. We need to say, we have an ability to engage them at all levels of their being. So if I can just help them with their physical needs, if I could just help them with their relational needs. If somebody came in here, this is the example I give. My friend Amy Simpson, who's an author and does a lot of speaking around this, she calls mental illness the no casserole illness, okay? Which usually when you're in a church, particularly if your wife becomes pregnant, people start bringing casseroles to your house. They're like, oh, you have cancer, here's a taco casserole, and so they do that because they don't know what to do, but they want to show you that they care. Well, tell somebody that your son has schizophrenia. They won't bring you a casserole. In fact, what most people tell me is that their son's name is never mentioned again. And so what I would say, this is such a great question, you do whatever you can do for a person in distress. So if that person, let's say the husband has depression and he's lost a job, and now the wife is trying to do it all. Well, if you could go over and take care of her children for a few hours while she could go out and get a respite, then you've helped her and you've helped that family in relationship to their mental health problem. If you could help them with their finances through your benevolence fund, if you could sit down with her over coffee and let her talk about her issues and just be present and pray with her, you've helped them. So you don't have to try to think about it from a mental health perspective. You just need to think about it from a ministry perspective, in the sense that, what can I do to help ease this person's distress or their suffering, and what can I do to show them the love of Christ? And, we can add all this fancy stuff about mental health on top of whoever wants to really get into that, if the rest of us just treat them the way we would treat anybody. So I always tell people, think about it this way. If you found out that your best friend's wife was pregnant, what would you do for that family? Just do that for the guy with mental health problem. And you're gonna be doing more, unfortunately, than most churches do. Great question. Great question.
That's the last one.
Okay.
Hello, we have the third question. Amen. Thank you so much for a fairly extensive briefing on the issue of mental health. With the Christly fear and prayerfully, I am still trying to wholly grasp at the enormity of faith concerns that were brought up in the talk, from potential race-based issues to the inability of our present generations, perhaps, to address directly issues of mental hygiene among professionals in the church or elsewhere. For example, I can hear you pause when you speak from the stage. That reflects a problem bodily function. Is it a concern that those are issues as well as regards mental health? And I guess my concern is that I am aware that in parallel health industries there are humane products being produced for animals so that they don't have to be medicated. Right. So just
no, that's good. I think that first to the medicated part, I think that medication in and of itself is it's not a magic bullet that cures mental health problems. It is just simply one tool in a tool belt, okay? And so for those who need medication, it can be wonderful. There are plenty of people that receive treatment for mental health problems and they never have to take medication. And then if you do receive treatment for mental health problems and you need medication, the best option is always for you to receive medication and therapy. And if you receive both, you tend to take less medication. And if you ever want to have the ability to stop taking the medication, if you need it, you have to get the therapy. There's just no way you're going to be able to get it. For certain illnesses like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, it's almost going to be necessary the person takes some level of medication. But depression, for instance, anxiety, those were treated effectively before medications existed. And they can be treated effectively without medication, although medication can be beneficial. So that's a great question in relationship to that. I think a lot of people are very concerned about taking medication, and rightly so. I mean, there are side effects. But you need a very comprehensive approach to care. Just like you wouldn't tell somebody, just pray, that's all you need, but prayer is very important, you wouldn't say, just take medicine and don't do these other things, okay? And then, in the context of kind of a broader problem that, kind of goes beyond mental health issues type of thing, a lot of times, particularly since it takes people so long to actually engage care, by the time they get some kind of care, they have so many other issues going on. And so, particularly like somebody who might have something like bipolar disorder or some borderline personality disorder or something like that, where they go into a kind of extreme phases of behavior, they will have a literal highway of destroyed relationships behind them that when they receive some relief from their illness, those don't just go away. They have to all be rebuilt. And so there's a lot of issues that kind of go around, just like people with mental health problems are notoriously have bad health because they don't take care of themselves physically. And so you treat their mental health problem, you then have to deal with the physical issues. And so it's much broader than just focusing on, and that's why, back to this great question in the back, which I just love that question, is that there's always something you can do, whether you know everything there is to know about mental health or nothing, because you are called to care for those that are suffering. You're called to share the love of Christ with those that are suffering. You're called to share the gospel to help transform them spiritually. So you always have an opportunity. But if we're able to build, just like the way Jesus built that relationship with that man, he healed him and never told him who he was. But later he has the opportunity to then share who he is as the Messiah, and it changes him eternally. So, great question. All right, well, thank you guys very much.
Thank you, Dr. Stanford. Dr. Stanford is you can tell, he's an expert in this field, excellent speaker, but most important now, he's a loving heart, taking time out of his busy schedule to go to churches and organizations to help them to train, because it's a heart of loving people. Thank you, Dr. Stanford. And thank you for kicking off an exciting weekend. Tomorrow morning we have the training starting bright early in the morning, and then tomorrow night we have a movie screen ages, and then Sunday we have the special topic, and also how to care for people who are in grief. Please take time to attend those meetings, and to end tonight's meeting. Let's end today's meeting with a word of prayer. Let's bow our word for a word of prayer. Father, thank you for an excellent night tonight, and thank you for bringing our awareness of the mental health and illness, and thank you for giving us directions as a church, and how to help the people who are in needs. Utilize our resources so that we can help those people, and also so that we can be the light and salt of this world, and also a blessing to this community. We can all do all this because you love us first. You died on the cross for us so that we can know how to love other people. Thank you. We ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Two other things. Number one, Dr. Gao, where are you? Can you stand up? Tomorrow in the morning, I need some brothers to help out to set up A157. If I have enough people, that should only take about 10 to 15 minutes. Please follow Dr. Gao to set it up. Also, if you have not got it, there's a resource list published by our FBCC. There's a referral list for mental health providers. I know some of those people personally. So thank you for putting this together, and if you do not have one, take one out, and if you have any questions, ask any of our staff. Thank you very much.